I want to rectify a few things about the subject of yesterday's episode. I spoke about remote work, and I think I ranted a little bit about Mark Andreessen and his concept that remote work is the future because it was imposed to us by the government, and therefore that's a trend. And I argued that that's the wrong way to look at things. Like trends don't happen top down; they happen bottom up. And I want to rectify a few things. Number one, I still believe that that is the wrong attitude. You can't possibly uh, bet on something which was imposed by the government. Or at least that's not the Silicon Valley way. Maybe that's what some people like to do. Cerberus, famously a private equity firm based in Washington, D.C., has been doing stuff like that, where they just basically follow the government and then invest in things that the government will do. When the Iraq War was about to happen, they started investing in logistics, technology, assets, and that kind of stuff. But let's put that aside, okay? Let's just talk about the bottom-up stuff. And I think there are a few good things to be said about remote work, but I don't want to call it remote work. I think it's the wrong way. I think DAO is a much better, decentralized autonomous organization. So the DAOs, which is a kind of a thing which is coming out of the crypto world or Web3, for lack of a better word, they have some aspects of maybe what Mark Andreessen is talking about. And he's not able to formulate it properly. But here's my point. Here's the way I want to rectify. I want to say the following. I think that old style companies that are just switching from office work to remote work, that's not going to work. That's not good. That's not productive. And that's why also Musk wants people to go back to the office, because Twitter is an old style company. However, having said that, I do think that there is definitely room for new types of organization of people. And I want to talk about this, and I think about, okay, what kind of organization could we have, and what are the advantages, and what kind of problems could be solved in a decentralized way relative to a non-decentralized way. This is not even wrong podcast. It's November 12th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. It's a Saturday. There's no update. For the year, we're down 52.4%. The market is down 13.6%. We're underperforming by 38.8%. So Mark Andreessen says that the company, his company, Andreessen Horowitz, has reorganized itself into remote work or the cloud because they want to be able to assess what the new types of companies will do, and the new type of work is decentralized. This is what he said, and I kind of ranted a bit yesterday about it because his main argument was that after the lockdown happened, he saw that and that kind of he thought, well, this is the future and so on and so forth. And I said, look, when things happen top down, usually it's not a good thing, and it has to happen organically. Then it's a trend. So that was my argument, and it still stands. However, I want to rectify a little bit because I do think that there is this concept of DAOs. I've spoken about this a few episodes ago. I think there's legitimate hope and interest in decentralized autonomous organizations. So let me parse that a little bit. What is a decentralized autonomous organization? It's a concept that is people can organize themselves around blockchain technology in a way where they can build a platform on which you get rewarded for certain things and punished for other things. And maybe within that context, you can incentivize people to do things together. In other words, this is maybe a way to organize people in a decentralized way because you solve some problems that, if you go way back, theory of the firm, Kenneth Arrow, one of the seminal papers in economics, I think from the 1930s, who says that the firm is just simply an organization of people that need to overcome transaction costs. This is all there is. Transaction costs, in particular, the problem of trust, right? If you think about it, like if I want to work with you, how do I trust you? So I'd rather you be with me together in the office so I can trust you. So those kinds of things, I would say, are probably what Arrow meant with theory of the firm and overcome transaction costs. Now, we fast forward 2022, we're still sitting in the same situation. We have firms organized around physical presence because of transaction costs and stuff like that. Now, I would argue that the main problem with firms in the physical presence space is deeper than that. The reason we want people to be together is not necessarily control and trust anymore, because we can solve that digitally over remote spaces. So I can have you do my payroll and you can be 5,000 miles away from me. That is possible. However, I think the problem comes from the three primitives of human behavior that I mentioned yesterday, which is complacency, confused relationship with the truth, and the status-driven nature of people. Those are the three things that are going to, those are primitives, so they will stand no matter what. Blockchain, no blockchain, Web3, Web2. This is human. This is stuff that changes over evolution, millions of years kind of stuff. So that's not going to change anytime soon, and it's certainly not going to change just because we impose lockdowns on people. Let me parse that a bit. What do I actually mean with these three primitives? Okay, a confused relationship with the truth, complacency, and status-driven. Let's start with status-driven. What status-driven really means is just the firehouse effect. Okay, so we have this urge to sort of please people with status so we can gain status. And I think if you are not in physical presence, the risk of firehouse effect is much higher. What's the firehouse effect? Well, it's the sort of the firehouse. Famously, the firemen sit in the firehouse, wait for the fire to happen. For a long time, nothing happens. They start talking to each other. They start believing in their own stuff, and so on and so forth. Now, you might think, well, isn't this exactly what happens when you have physical presence? Wall Street, for example, famously, or Hollywood, which are super cities in a sense that they have this physical presence, and nevertheless, there is this firehouse effect. Everybody believes in their own stuff, and so on and so forth. And I would say yes, to some degree that's true. And if you have a more decentralized workforce, I think it's possible to have less of a firehouse effect. However, I believe that the way we are solving the remote work problem right now, which is simply enabling communication and not solving for the firehouse effect, is actually going to amplify the firehouse effect. And you can see that already. Like one example, I think Andreessen Horowitz, if you ask me, they are deteriorating as a company. They're making mistakes. They're not interesting enough. They're not sharp enough. Their comments are contradictory, because I think there's a certain firehouse effect proliferating throughout their comments, because I guess they're not all sitting on Zoom talking to each other, and so on and so forth. The second primitive is the confused relationship with the truth. I want to just leave that, again, I don't, there's no ethical comments here or anything like that. Lying, not lying, all that, I don't care. The one problem is we just have a difficulty admitting mistakes. And that's, of course, that kind of feeds into the firehouse effect that I mentioned in the first place. But mistakes, correcting errors. I'm going to talk about the Popperian approach to problem solution a bit later, but I think it's a key feature of anything, any kind of disruption, anything which enables progress requires error correction. People have to be able to admit errors, and I would argue that physical presence helps with that problem. And if we want to build a decentralized workforce, let's say a DAO, should be solving for the ability for people to be accountable for mistakes, to be detected. Even mistakes have to be detected in the first place. So all of these kinds of things need to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to have a better solution. And the third is complacency. Complacency just means, look, if I'm comfortable with something, I'm going to keep doing that. And maybe in the beginning, it's actually a good thing. But over time, complacency just leads to suboptimal solutions. Again, physical presence makes that less acute. Simple example, you go to the gym by yourself every day, you keep training, you will start forming bad habits, as people say. So let's say you're a boxer, you train by yourself with a bag, you do the conditioning, you can even watch YouTube videos. But if you are exposed to other people, if you are exposed physically to other people, you see how they train, you will hopefully be less complacent. You will hopefully do less, acquire less bad habits. So again, the three primitives of human behavior: one is complacency, which means you build bad habits. Second, confused relationship with the truth. You have a hard time admitting mistakes. And third, eager for status, which amplifies the firehouse effect. Those are the three things that, from my point of view, let's say a DAO should be able to solve for, if you really want to be a decentralized autonomous organization. By the way, decentralized autonomous organization doesn't necessarily mean you have to be physically not present. You can be physically present and work on a DAO. So that the question of remote, this is a simple reorganization of work, do we need to be physically present at work or not? And my answer is, for the problems that lend themselves to something like that, yes, but for everything else, no. Physical presence is still required until we solve for the three major problems of human behavior, complacency, confused relationship with the truth, and status. If we can solve for those three things, then a DAO has a chance. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to organize yourself, but at least it's a chance. If you don't solve for those three things, DAO has no chance. And now I want to say two things in terms of prepare. I think Popper is a philosopher who has come up with a very simple concept of how science works and pretty much anything else works. And it is based on the concept of iteration, of finding errors and error correction. Now, there's been lots of different phrases, lots of different interpretations, but Popper was generally disregarded in the 20th century, even though from my point of view, he was the most important philosopher of the 20th century. And people like David Deutsch are kind of picking him up again and trying to proliferate him throughout the system of epistemology and then hopefully also other areas of science. Because what Popper does is give us a very simple, practical solution to the question of how is knowledge created. It gives a practical solution to the question, what is disruption? It gives a practical solution to the question, what enables progress? And actually also a practical solution to the question, what is a startup and what is the minimum amount of people you need to create a startup, and how do you organize successfully a startup? All of these questions can be solved by Popper's epistemology. Now, within that context, I think I want to answer Peter Thiel's question, what is a startup? And the answer Peter Thiel gives is the minimum amount of people you need to organize around the problem. And I want to add to that, it is also the right way to organize people around the problem. And the right way to organize people around the problem is, should they be physically present? What kind of people do I need? What kind of backgrounds? All of these questions can be solved by the Popperian approach and by adding my three primitives, which is, again, complacency, status, and confused relationship with the truth. If we can solve for those problems efficiently, we have a startup. So if a problem is building a car battery at low cost so people adopt electric cars, the answer is, well, we have to find a way to organize ourselves best so we can solve for all these problems. And I think the best way to do that in most cases is physical presence and then have the right backgrounds, of course, which is, typical HR type of work. But the physical presence is important because we have this reciprocity of seeing people that they let's say they don't fall into the trap of complacency. We have the status thing, which allows what I mean with that. Let's say, why is the firehouse effect so dangerous? If I'm on Zoom and there's a certain consensus, let's say I'm on Zoom with Mark Andreessen and whatever girl was interviewing him recently in an interview, and let's say I'm on Zoom with them, and then they keep talking about how great it is to work remotely. It's very difficult for me to change that, to really radically change their mindset. And part of that is, if you want to argue with people about something that they're really convinced about in a civilized way, okay, there is something called a discourse. All the way back to the Greeks, they were sitting there in their robes talking about stuff. Well, they weren't using messengers on a remote setting to talk about it. They wanted to be physically present. Why? Well, because we have clues. We have technologies which evolved over millions of years. We have facial expressions. We have threats, soft threats, hard threats, whatever it is. We have technologies that evolution has helped us build over many millennia to deal with that. And now, how can we change people's minds? I think this is what's so key. Like, if I'm transactional, if I'm just agreeing on stuff, I do agree that in a world like that, I don't necessarily need physical presence. If I wanna open an account with a bank, that's fine. I can do it over the phone. I don't need to be physically present on the counter. But if I want to convince my bank to give me a loan, if I want to argue with them about interest rate that they're overcharging me, I might want to be actually present. It's much, much more helpful because, again, I have technologies that can help me. And the people that, might say, well, VR, AR, we're going to get there. My point is, yes, but let's make it organic. Yeah, develop it and then have organic DAOs evolve through that. No problem. That I have with Andreessen. Okay, if something's imposed from the top, it almost never happens. If something grows organically, if like this is his own words, I call it the law of Andreessen. If smart people voluntarily work on something over time, it actually will happen. It almost always happens. But if something is imposed from the top, it almost never happens, or basically it won't happen. So that's kind of the way I see the world. That's the way I see this particular idea of remote work versus not remote work. And in particular, that's where I see the question of what is a successful company, a wealth generating company, because this is really what it's all about. In the end, if I don't organize myself in a way that I can generate the most amount of wealth per unit of let's say input, energy, money, then what's the point? And as an investor, I mean, this is really what we're most interested in. I believe that the main problem with the current remote work mania is also that it is coming from the employees because it's more convenient for them, and it doesn't work because the companies weren't built for that type of solution. So to summarize, the remote work question that I raised yesterday as a reaction to Mark Andreessen's interview and his touting remote work is I think he's wrong because it can't be applied to the old style of companies. There has to be a new company, a new DAO, let's call it, that comes out organically, that is not imposed by the government, and that solves for the three primitives of human behavior, which is complacency, status, and the confused relationship with the truth. If you have something like that, then maybe organically you can grow. And just last thing I want to mention here is that GitHub actually is a possible solution, because what GitHub does, most importantly, it keeps people accountable. You can see who made errors. You can see also who made good things. You can correct errors very fast. I don't know about the firehouse effect. I'm not a very active software developer myself. I do a little bit of work on GitHub, but not that much. So I can't tell how much the firehouse effect is derailing projects. But I would think that that is probably part of the risk that GitHub hasn't been able to solve, because when Git and when Linus started with Linux and all that stuff was developed, I doubt that he was that concerned about that. Maybe he was. It'd be interesting to ask him that. So I think GitHub, again, accountability, skin in the game, which is a different concept, which just means that you can have that's what the idea of the DAO is, that if you put your own money and you have skin in the game, maybe you can solve for some of the problems. But I think complacency, again, if I go to the gym voluntarily and train by myself, I still fall into the trap of bad habits, and I have to overcome that. And the best way to overcome that is by having reciprocity, by having exposure to other human beings. Thank you.